Good evening. My name is Elena Sudakova. I'm director of Pushkin House, and it gives me a great pleasure to introduce tonight's event. It's for several decades now since we relocated to Bloomsbury Square that we have been bringing together leading and questioning minds around politics, economics, social history, and culture. This informs our programming strand that we preliminarily call Forum, and as part of this strand, we discuss potential futures and possible pasts of Russia. Therefore, I'm very proud to introduce to you Charles Hecker, a journalist, a geopolitical risk consultant, and Pushkin House patron, who's presenting his new book, Zero Sum, where he explores the process of doing business in Russia, drawing on his decades of experience as a journalist there, but also on his interviews with senior executives, government officials, and academics. And Charles will be in conversation with journalist Dasha Afanasieva. I very much look forward to this stimulating discussion, but just to let you know that after the talk, there will be drinks available over at Pushkin House at the bar, and a very special souvenir, which if you buy a book, it's a biscuit. You get one for free, or you can buy just a souvenir without the book. Okay, over to you, Chuck and Dasha.
Hi everyone, my name's Dasha. I'm a reporter and a long-time Russia watcher. I'm really happy to have Charles Hecker here today to talk about his excellent book, Zero Sum. I really enjoyed reading it, and I thought it was just this amazing combination of both the history of business in Russia and this amazing access to executives that I know as a journalist it's incredibly difficult to talk to. So it's really great how you've worked, sort of taken your decades in geopolitical risk and turned it into something so insightful. So congratulations.
Thank you. It's extremely nice of you to say. Thank you very much.
Excellent. We've got about an hour and a half until they unleash us onto the bar. So I'll start by asking a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Can we start with the basics? Could you talk to us about why you decided to write this book and why you saw an opportunity and why it's called Zero Sum?
Thank you for that, and thank you Pushkin House and Elena, and thank you everybody for coming this evening. It's just a great pleasure to be here with all of you. So I was going for a walk in Haggerston Park one afternoon, shortly after the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And two things were happening at the time, and that is that this is when Western companies, international companies that I might refer to in shorthand as Western companies, started to leave Russia after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And I was still working full-time at Control Risks, and this is also when clients began to call the office to sort of say, what should we be doing? And it just sort of occurred to me that, every good book or every good story that you want to read should have a beginning and then a middle or a peak and then an end. And even though the start of the full-scale invasion is not the end of the international presence in Russia, it's a very messy end. And what happened with that event was the creation of a narrative arc that has a sort of a kickoff, a peak, and then a denouement. And so I thought, okay, this feels like a book. And so I thought that this would be the time to do it. And why it's called Zero Sum is a couple of things. So broadly speaking, Zero Sum comes from game theory and sort of says that when two parties come together, one wins and one loses. And so one winds up on the plus side, one winds up on the negative side, and the sum together is zero sum, and we'll get to that in half a second. But I named it Zero Sum more because I thought, for the companies that have left Russia, some of them after decades of effort and investment and people and really hard work, that what this represented, their exit from Russia represented a sort of zeroing out of their accounts. And for a lot of these companies, everything that they put into that country and that market over the years was lost. A lot of companies left in a hurry. Some left more slowly, some very deliberately, some were pulled out or forced out, but it was sort of a zeroing of the account of that presence in Russia over all of these years. The other thing is that the deal making in the Russian market, particularly in the early days, but not exclusively in the early days, had a very zero-sum mentality. You know, this American concept of being in a win-win situation where both parties in a deal sort of come out with more than they had when they went in, that approach to deal-making and business-making took a while to take root in the Russian market. And so zero-sum kind of serves two purposes, you know, on the cover and then also on the inside. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, yes. I think that there is a mentality difference that I can see how that plays out in business as well. And if we think about February 22, what do you think was the process of how did companies, because you were still working in the industry then, how did companies make their decisions of whether to leave or not? I mean, looking at the statements, it was still a time when I think companies felt really pressured to have an opinion and to voice their opinion, moral opinion, and a lot of them criticized the war, and some of those companies left. How do you think they went through that process?
So one of the things that I learned when I was reporting the book is that companies and their decision-making processes are almost as unique and individual as people when they make decisions, that no single company makes a decision in the same way that almost any other company does. And so there were, when the war began, when the full-scale invasion began, there were a group of companies that said, we're out, this is it, we're done, we've got to get out of here. And sort of voluntarily, if you will, decided this isn't the place for us anymore. Prior to that, there was a smaller group of companies that after 2014 and after the illegal annexation of Crimea, there was a smaller subset of companies actually that left kind of even more voluntarily. And they said, you know, we don't like the way this is going, this isn't our cup of tea anymore, and even in 2014, we're out. There were companies that were pulled out of Russia, I guess you could say, for lack of a better expression. They were pulled out by shareholders. They were pulled out by activist investors. They were pulled out by public pressure. You know, the amount of naming and shaming that was going on of companies that were either slow to leave or reluctant to leave at all from Russia, the amount of pressure on these companies was absolutely massive. And so there were some companies that left because their shareholders and their stakeholders said, we're not going to invest in you anymore if you stay. There were companies who left because their government said, out. We don't want you there anymore. You know, you're a national flagship, you're a state-owned enterprise, you're associated with a certain flag, and we want you out. And, you know, then as time wore on, that process got increasingly difficult. We might talk about that a little bit later. And, you know, so it was just, it depended on risk appetite, it depended on sector, it depended on nationality, it depended on the size of your business in Russia. This was no easy decision for companies that were doing very well there. And so I was going to say everyone, but every company made its decision almost completely independently.
And that's kind of where your book starts, sort of Western executives facing the fact that they might not be able to go to Russia, that this like colossally massive, tragic, horrendous thing that a lot of us didn't believe would happen, happened. Do you think that sort of after 2014, in the community and the people that you interviewed, did people fear this? And sort of to what extent did they understand how much of a game changer 2014 was?
Yeah, again, lots of different answers to that question. So, you know, there were signs of what was going on. And by the way, you know, the whole book was written over the past year and a half with the benefit of hindsight. And the benefit of hindsight from me and the benefit of hindsight from everybody who I interviewed in the book. And so we try very carefully to avoid abusing the position of hindsight in the way that we look at events, but So, tell me the question again. That was too long of a creative digression.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about when companies are making this decision.
Oh, 2014.
Should they have,
yeah.
should they have, basically,
Yeah.
should they have known? Which is
So-
a question I think we'll keep coming back to, really.
Here's what happened after 2014. Sorry about that. Thank you. So 2014 was the illegal annexation of Crimea, and essentially one country violently and illegally whacking off a piece of another country. For the business community, this was, in some respects, a very important moment. One of many very important moments along the whole spectrum of what happened leading up to the war. And again, this was the trigger for some companies to say, you know, we're on guard over this. Something bad is going to happen, and we don't like the direction of travel. For other companies, Crimea was really not that big a deal. And it was just, you know, Crimea is kind of hard to find on a map. A lot of our customers or a lot of the people at home don't know where it is. There wasn't a whole lot of bloodshed. And, you know, business in Russia up to that point was going pretty well. Russia was at that point becoming a reasonably predictable place to do deals. And there were companies that thought, well, you know, maybe this will all blow over. And maybe Crimea isn't that big a deal. Sort of like Georgia. You know, an invasion of another sovereign state, but one that we don't think about all that much. And I remember one of the interviews in the book was with an executive from a German company who said when he got a call from headquarters in Berlin, his bosses and the executives turned to him and said, you know, what's happening in Crimea is just a horrible thing, but can you try to boost your sales figures for next year? So it was mixed.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure if it was the same German executive, but someone summarized it as, we know this isn't right, but we'll follow sanctions and let's move on.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, you could argue that it was up to, the political response wasn't very strong either, so if you're taking your cue from that.
Yeah. So for the companies, I mean, look, one of the frustrating things about writing the book that it was impossible to nail down concretely exactly how many foreign registered companies there are in Russia. That number is out there somewhere, but it's not the easiest one to nail down. Similarly, it's hard to nail down exactly how many companies have left and exactly how many companies have stayed. And, you know, there's different kinds of leaving and there's different kinds of staying. But the signals were very, very mixed from the beginning. And, you know, I just don't think that, you know, the incentives to stay, if you could afford it, reputationally, financially, and politically, were strong enough for thousands of companies to still remain in Russia. The sanctions issue was, you know, is a red line. And if you were forced to leave Russia, you were forced by sanctions. If the sanctions didn't touch on your sphere of activity, or if you could restructure your business without incurring a crippling cost of that sort of work, then you could stay. You know, sanctions, what I should have said from the very beginning, sanctions was a major motivating factor, and they just kept rolling and coming and coming and coming from the UK, from the EU, from the US, from the rest of the G7. You know, there was a sort of tidal wave of sanctions coming at companies. If you could get around them, great. If they weren't in your sector, also great. And for a lot of companies, that's the only distinction that mattered to them. If sanctions prevented them from working, they would go. If they didn't, they'd stay.
Yeah, and I mean, the sanctions, even though they were quite dramatic, they, you know, if you could actually just give us a rundown, because they weren't, a lot of people seemed to think in the aftermath, I know I've written endless stories about, like, editors being surprised that yes, you can absolutely get a Snickers bar, and there's absolutely no law prohibiting having a Coke. So if you sort of go through the different sectors and how difficult was it for companies to stay if they wanted to? Yeah.
So there's a whole range. I mean, if you look at companies like Boeing and Airbus and that level of sort of, you know, industrial titans, sanctions prevented them from doing anything in Russia, and they had to go. All of the Boeing aircraft and all of the jets that are bolted onto Aeroflot airliners, those could no longer be serviced specifically because of sanctions, and they had to go. If you look, for example, in the financial services sector, there are a lot of banks that are still there. And sanctions on them are tightening, and the regulatory crackdown, sanctions aside, is there. But there are a handful of foreign banks that are still there. There are companies that have thought very creatively, both Russian companies as customers and Western companies as suppliers, and who have rerouted their goods into Russia. And what I learned as a result of all the interviews and the research is that it is wise of us to anticipate that companies will obey the letter of the law. It is not always satisfying to anticipate that companies will obey the spirit of the law. Because any number of researchers have shown how German auto parts to exports to Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan have increased by multiples of 1,000. And that's because they're going into Central Asia and they're crossing the border into Russia that way. So that's the sanctions workaround that, I suppose strictly speaking, isn't in violation of the letter of the sanctions, but certainly it's caused a certain amount of reputational damage. And then you have companies that aren't sanctioned at all, and that includes companies for humanitarian reasons or the consumer goods sector. There hasn't been very strong sanctioning of the sort of biscuits that you find on the shelves in supermarkets across Russia. They're all still there, from Mondelez and Pepsi and all of the other kind of snack manufacturers, sort of that level of manufacturing and industry. So there have been more than 14 rounds of sanctions, I think, from the US, the UK, the EU, and everybody else. There's the cap on oil exports, the price cap. But some companies are still there and still doing business.
And do you think it's fair to, from my reporting, it does seem like the companies that had big production facilities, and if the law didn't require them to leave, and if a big chunk, say Pepsi, I think 5% of its sales comes from Russia, and that just explained whether you went or not. So after all of the sort of posturing in terms of morals and donating money to Ukraine, etc., it still just came down to dollars and cents, and that's all investors really cared about. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's a fair characterization, absolutely. And there was something, there was a quote that I used in the book from the FT, from the CEO of Mondelez, which is the big sort of confectionery and biscuits and sort of snack manufacturer, who said directly to the journalist that he was talking to, he said, "Our shareholders don't care if we're in Russia or not." And so Mondelez, I think, in his further explanation, and in the explanation of a lot of other companies on the topic of sanctions and remaining in Russia, what they said were things like, we won't expand our business, we won't invest in our business, we won't do any sales or marketing or advertising, we're not going to hire people. Some companies have been caught out on that. But they said basically to kind of mollify their critics, who were substantial, they said, look, we're going to stay, but we're not going to make much of it. So kind of leave us alone. Some of these companies have seen their sales drop in Russia as a result of no longer marketing and no longer advertising. And they're fine with that. But, they are still there. They have compromised by not going big on Russia like they used to, but they remain a presence.
And when you said that they were caught out, by the statement about not increasing headcount, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so there was an incident, and I can't remember exactly which company it was. It'll come to me when this is all over, probably. Mm-hmm. It'll come to me, but there was a company that said, we're not growing in Russia, we're not investing, we won't increase our sales, we're just going to sort of sit tight. And then there was a sort of employment magazine or a financial magazine that was showing their sort of recruitment advertisements, saying, hey, come work for us, we're a growing business. And so they were very publicly in the international press, hung out to dry over that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this week Bloomberg interviewed the Unilever CEO, Heinz Schumacher, and he talked about how the reason why they eventually sold later than everyone else, sold the Russia business was because they were losing control, so they couldn't, sort of have access to accounts, they couldn't take money out. So what are these sort of other secondary effects of maybe sanctions or of Russia's government quite hostile attitude to Western companies now that's impacting them?
So the flip side of this equation is that staying in Russia wasn't very easy. And so companies that remain in Russia are not able to repatriate profits. And they are by and large working now in a fairly hostile environment, particularly those companies that come from what are known as, unfriendly nations. And so they are kind of tagged that they're from a place that is hostile to Russia and who is supporting Ukraine, for example. And then a few other things happened that were quite dramatic and really changed the landscape for Russian companies, and Unilever is a great example. Unilever is one of the companies, because it's a high-profile consumer brand, or has many high-profile consumer brands under its umbrella. Unilever came under amazing pressure from, in particular, a group based at Yale University, at the Yale School of Management, that was doing this very public naming and shaming. And Unilever is also no stranger to controversy in its activities in other markets around the world, and so this all happened in Russia as well, and they wanted to leave. But what happened gradually as the war progressed, and as it became obvious that lots of companies were leaving, is that Russia essentially sort of tried to slam the door shut, and they made the exit process extremely painful for international companies, genuinely sort of painful. Again, another German executive described this as a mosh pit, trying to get out of Russia. So it was sort of philosophically very painful and also financially very painful. There was a significant exit tax that I think is now at 15% of the sale price. And the other thing is that exiting companies had to be valued by a list of auditors that were chosen by the Russian government and then sold, if the transaction went through, sold for only 50% of what they were worth. And so when it came time to want to leave, and there's one other thing to talk about in this, forgive me for a sort of long-winded answer, but there were a lot of companies that felt like they were trapped on flypaper. They kind of wanted to get out, but it was like their feet were sort of stuck to the ground, and they really just couldn't lift themselves off that flypaper and get out. The other thing, the final thing that happened with the under-exit strategies is there have been nationalizations, there have been company seizures, there is a creeping, or maybe not even so creeping, reallocation of assets going on in Russia to the current moment. And the high-profile ones were Carlsberg and Danone that were just taken and then redistributed. But the more creeping and even more insidious process underway is sort of not just changes in ownership, but changes in management at companies with professionals who are more favorable to the current political climate and to the Kremlin. And there is a gradual erosion, not only of property rights, but also just a company's ability to control its own affairs in Russia. And so, it's everything from outright grabs to slightly more subtle means in the changing of management and ownership.
So sort of control, local management kind of, creeps in, and gradually just you don't even have a company anymore, but you don't notice because it's on the outwards. It looks like
exactly right.
It's still
exactly
under your
right.
control. So I guess just to also just wanted to make the point or ask you what your view was. Even if you've been in Russia during this incredibly lucrative time, when people started buying loads of buying Western biscuits and getting pet food, for example, is a massive booming area. Just to clarify, even if you had your business seized, it's we shouldn't get the violins out too much for these companies, should we? Because Russia's still been monumentally profitable. So when they're just sort of turning to investors or whatever for sympathy, I'm not sure we should grant them that.
Okay, this was unrehearsed, and that's a tough question. And whether we should be sort of getting the violins out for companies. If you're a shareholder in one of those companies, you're in a pretty bad state right now, and you probably wish somebody was playing the violin for you. I think the disappointment, and on the term of really violins, so many people that I spoke to for the book expressed a sense of regret of what's happened. Regret in a number of ways, and that is that everyone, I think, with a very important exception, everyone wanted this to turn out differently. Everybody wanted Russia's business trajectory, its political trajectory, to work out differently and to go in a different direction. And so I think it was the crushing of these expectations, whether they might have been reevaluated or not along the way, is important. The fact that Russia did not fully integrate, did not have a seat at the international table, is, I think, material. And a lot of people left a place that they began, foreigners, left a place that they began to call home. And again, maybe none of this is grounds for pity party. Everybody made money while the sun shined. And then when things got cloudy, a number of people stayed and a number of people turned and ran. The question here, I guess, and it's in the final chapter of the book, is what did we learn from this? I suppose, if you don't get the violins out if no one takes a lesson from all of this. And if nobody figures, there were more questions I'm going to ask next time, I'm going to recalibrate my expectations more frequently next time, and shareholders are going to say, you better not make the same mistake next time. If people don't ask those questions, you don't get the violins out.
But I guess the other side of the flippant violin comment is also that if they were faced with the same if the same things happened, they'd possibly do exactly the same, because they made their money, and it would have been difficult to justify to shareholders to leave in 2014, right? They wouldn't have accepted that because the world didn't understand the degree. It's mind-boggling to me how they didn't understand, because obviously territory was seized and it was massively illegal, but they didn't. So surely companies would just do exactly the same thing if all of this was repeated.
So first, you're right. Crimea just wasn't a big enough trigger, period. Companies will probably do this over and over again. And if you look at what's happening in China, and this is apples and oranges, and we can't really make these comparisons, but in countries that present significant market opportunity, but equally significant political or geopolitical risk, it's emerged over the course of reporting the book that essentially market opportunity won. I think, for those of us who are in the geopolitical risk business, it's gratifying, ironically perhaps, to see that this is something that people care about more than ever before. And that geopolitical risk is absolutely at the top of almost every board agenda, at public companies, at private companies, at anybody doing business in the former Soviet Union, in China, in the Middle East, in India, in Argentina, you name it. But it's part of a bigger equation. And there is never one sole factor, unless it's something, gravely tragic. Hard to say that this war isn't gravely tragic, because it is. But there's never one single decision that causes a company to turn around and leave. And so geopolitics and political risk is one of them, but it's a bigger one, but it's never the sole thing that will drive that decision.
Some of the parts of the book that I enjoyed most were the case studies, and where you kind of went into the history of business, in particular the Siemens example. And Siemens has been in Russia for 170 years, but then Siemens was actually caught doing business in Crimea when it was against sanctions post 2014. So could you tell us a bit about the Siemens example and what? Because the really annoying voice in my head keeps screaming like they should have known. And the Siemens example is, you don't need hindsight to understand Russian business. You don't need hindsight from 2014 to now. You have these examples over decades of what it's like to do business there, right?
Yeah, so, well, I think there will be a couple of times when, sort of like if you're watching a football match and you're screaming at the television, there'll be a couple of times when you're reading this book and you're sort of screaming at the page, and I sort of hope that does happen. And the Siemens example is a great one. It was shocking to me to learn that there are just endless numbers of books and journal articles and newspaper articles and sort of oral histories all devoted to the history of Siemens in Russia, because it started in the 1800s. And the Winter Palace was illuminated from within by Siemens light bulbs. And Nevsky Prospect, the main drag in Petersburg, is illuminated by Siemens light bulbs. And all the stores had Siemens light bulbs. And Siemens has an illustrious and long-standing history with lots and lots of ups and downs, and the Crimea violations. And wasn't it also the turbines at the end of the day that were stuck in Canada? That one too. And they made all of the same mistakes literally century after century and decade after decade. And there were companies, including Siemens, including French companies and British companies, Belgian companies, American companies, who made all kinds of deals and transactions in Russia in the Tsarist period. And they thought, oh good, we're friends with the Tsar, or we're friends with the local governor, or we've got mates in high places. And then, there's a change in the ruling family, and all of those connections turn to dust, and all of that investment and all of that effort has to, start from scratch and gets you nowhere. There was also a deeply, deeply corrupt business environment in Russia in the 1800s and in the Soviet period, and companies learned the right way, the wrong way, the easy way, the hard way about doing business in deeply corrupt atmospheres and environments. They went through everything, and they went through it over and over again. And maybe that's the answer to the violin question. And that is, look, it depends on how much historical memory is preserved from what you did when you were putting light bulbs in the Winter Palace to when you're sort of doing gas turbines in, the 2000s or the 1990s. But I knew that there was a historical lesson somewhere about doing business in Russia, and it's there. And if you're sort of yelling at the pages because Siemens and lots of other companies, history repeated itself, it's true. It happened over and over again.
And then the other anecdote that kind of makes me incredibly sort of suspicious of people who had higher hopes and who thought that Russian business would evolve differently in a much more positive arc than it has done is the General Motors example, which is when a female general manager of it came in, and she'd been trying to set up. Well, you tell it better.
Well, so an awful lot of people, some of them I think are in this room, an awful lot of people were extremely generous with their time and their experience in talking, to me about the book, for the book. And one of them was Heidi McCormack, who ran the joint venture that produced the Chevy Niva, the sort of Jeep-like vehicle that was an absolute landmark deal because it was the Chevy badge, that Chevy logo, on the hood of a Russian Jeep. And that was in itself symbolically massive. Financially it was massive, and industrially it was massive, and it took years of negotiations and tense moments and weekends, working all night long through the whole weekend, downing gallons of vodka with Russian colleagues to sort of grease the wheels a little bit. And it was going fine. And then, without giving too much away, Heidi noticed that there was an incredible amount of what they call shrinkage. There was an incredible amount of loss in all of the parts and all of the components that go into the Jeep, that go into the Niva. And they couldn't understand, where were all of these parts going? Like, why aren't they going into the cars and coming off the assembly line? And General Motors discovered that there was a tunnel built under, they built a new assembly line in a new building for the factory to roll off the Niva. And General Motors discovered that there was a tunnel under the factory that was siphoning components out of the assembly line and out of the delivery channels to the assembly process. And then they were being sold to the benefit of all of the people who were managing Avtovaz, the manufacturer of the Niva. And Heidi wanted to shut this down. This is one of the things that she was measured, one of the criteria that her performance was measured on, and that was, how many spare parts went walking. And so she asked a security company, how do we do this? And the security company said, if you shut this down, you'll get killed. So she went and got another security company. And they said, if you shut this down, you'll get killed. So they went to a third security company. And there's a 2-week period in the summer, if I recall correctly, when all assembly lines are shut down for routine maintenance. And so there was nothing suspicious, and it was, everybody goes away, and it's all planned well in advance, and they poured cement into the tunnel to shut it down, and then carried on as if nothing had happened. And that was the only way that they could stop the flow of spare parts out onto the black market.
So that's quite
Is that the one you were
incredible.
thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, because what's amazing about that is that...
And Heidi's alive, by the way. She's alive and well.
Is that you'll be a General Motors shareholder, and if you'd heard that, you might think twice about whether the company should be in Russia at all, surely.
So there's a live example of a company, super high-profile American company, suffering mysterious and unexplained losses in their assembly process, and staying. Because somewhere along the line, it was determined that this was worth it. What got them out in the end, I think the joint venture, the Niva joint venture, relatively speaking, across this whole scope of, since 1991 and the start of the Russian market, the Niva production ended relatively recently. And that's because at the end of the day, there were sort of currency problems, there were sales problems, the European market for imported or sort of JV, General Motors vehicles in general was soft, and sales were down everywhere. And so once that primary key indicator started to head south, that's when the JV ended, not when they discovered that they were being fleeced from the assembly floor.
And again, sort of to the point of, they must have known, or in favor of the argument that companies knew what they were getting themselves into, and to an extent were complicit. You talk about how you knew, if you're a Western company, that you had to have your own Krusha in Russia. So could you tell us about that and explain what you meant?
Yeah, this is a bit of a blast from the past. And so, everyone knew going in that Russia in the 1990s, when there was a lot of initial investment, was, at the street level, just an absolute sort of political and economic circus. It was just this street level bazaar with very little sort of control. And I remember when I was a reporter at the Moscow Times, writing an article about the beer drinkers' party, which had been formed, I think in advance of Yeltsin's 1996 re-election campaign, or maybe the 1993 Duma elections. In any case, there were, it was just a complete, absolute bazaar. And one of the features of that bazaar was Russia was highly criminalized at the time. And the newspapers all around the world, and people who were doing business there, and people who were observing from afar, everyone was talking about the Russian mafia. More specifically, just sort of organized crime that wasn't a traditional sort of Cosa Nostra style mafia, but was organized criminal activity. And everyone knew it was there. And again, this was seen as, well, this is just something we're going to have to work with, and it's something we're going to have to overcome, and it's an obstacle to doing business, but here's this massive market. And let's not forget that the impetus to going to Russia was this was happening at a time when the world was globalizing. Globalization was this super hot buzzword. And so if you weren't going to Russia, in spite of all of this, you as a company or as a manager, you were seen as irresponsible or derelict. And that saying, no, Russia's not for us right now, was crazy at the time, because everyone was going everywhere at that time. So you had to manage the criminal threat. You had to manage the criminal threat, for example, if you were in the alcohol business, because a truck full of vodka or a truck full of whiskey is the same thing as a truck full of cash. Same thing with cigarettes. So you had to do something to protect yourself from criminality, and also from internal criminality. I mean, there's the sort of physical, sort of heavies and guns criminality, and then there's also the sort of fraud and sort of white collar and paper-based criminality. And one of the ways that companies thought would be an effective way of managing this threat would be to get something called a Krusha. Krusha is Russian for roof, and this meant, basically it was almost sort of buying into a protection racket. There were more sophisticated types of roofs, Krushas, and there were less sophisticated types of Krushas. It was thought that if you had the right political patron, then that person would use his or her political authority and power to keep you safe. There were some companies that went and hired massive security providers or developed huge internal security departments and thought, well, this will be our cover. This will keep us safe. And then there were other companies that sort of really engaged in this process and said, well, if you're coming at us with heavy guys with gold chains and crew cuts, we're just going to get bigger guys, with heavier gold chains and with shaved heads instead of crew cuts. And, just sort of escalated the whole thing, thinking, this is an effective Krusha for us. Most of those deals, not surprisingly, ended very badly. And the political Krushas, too, were kind of tricky. And, there's this phenomenal line in the book from another German executive who said, we thought in the German business community, we thought we had the ultimate Krusha because Putin had a soft spot for Germany. And this executive said, we did. We had the ultimate Krusha until we started supplying weapons to Ukraine.
Yeah. So
until we started supplying weapons to Ukraine.
So just, to be clear, Putin didn't, it's not like Putin cleaned all of this up, because of course there's the Putin narrative that, the 90s were crazy, but I cleaned everything up, and then Russia became like a normal country. How much truth to that is there from the Western company perspective?
It depends on how you define cleaning up, right? So the evolution from the 90s to the 2000s was a sort of an evolution from the thick necks and the gold chains to sort of people in expensive designer suits, and the taking of criminality, roughly speaking, sort of in-house into the government, essentially. And so the shootouts stopped, but the corruption and the fraud and the pressure from the government replaced it, and I don't think ever really went away.
So just to tie all of that up, and then we absolutely have to get to Trump, which is a big, unfortunately. If you think about kind of the role of Western businesses in, I think, arguably strengthening Putin, because Russia opened up and there's this whole narrative that Western businesses and consultants like you have contributed to, and how do Western companies see themselves in that context, and how do you, now that we'll see how truly tragic and horrendous the outcome, which of course no one could have predicted, should we have been as positive on Russian business when we knew all of these stories, that are in the book, the people who are the actors in Russia were clear how far it still had to go?
So this is the second element of regret. There is regret that things turned out the way they did, and that Russia is not, a sort of sophisticated, equal international business partner at the very least, let alone political partner. There's that kind of regret. The second kind of regret, and there's not just two times, there's more, but the next one is, did we feed the monster? I mean, and if that's kind of the heart of your question.
Absolutely,
yeah. And there is some of that in the book. There are some people who said, we did what we could, and after a certain point, for the companies or the individuals or the investors who saw all of these signs along the way, Crimea, or the 2007 Munich speech, or the handling of the Kursk, or Beslan, or all of these events, along the way, Yukos, to name a few. They sort of said we should have known. But back then, worst case scenarios like the one that we're living through now were always seen as just that, a worst case scenario, an outlier, a low likelihood event. And nobody thought, feeding the monster, nobody thought it would come to this. And maybe we should have. And yeah, as a consultant involved in, hundreds of market entry exercises, what were we thinking? And that's the first line of the book, in the preface, is what were we thinking? And we were thinking short term, we were thinking medium term, sometimes we thought long term, and we never saw this. And there is a mea culpa in the book about all of that, a mea culpa and a sort of notra culpa about that in the book. But it's, we never thought it would get this bad.
We never, and I think there was an understanding of the mainstream view was that Russia was integrated into the Western economy, and that would be too much to give up. And now with hindsight, there seems to be an arrogance to that, because of course the global South is so much more important and powerful and relevant. So you even wonder, who cares if Unilever's in Russia? There's I don't know. What do you think about maybe companies? Maybe we shouldn't be as harsh, to play devil's advocate, as harsh on companies.
Yeah, no, please do. Look. So arrogance has a place in this discussion, without question. Another word came to my mind as you were speaking, and that was hope. And that is that all along the way, we hoped that things would turn out differently. And I think that that's what comes as a result of perhaps not aggressively enough and not frequently enough challenging our assumptions about how this was all going to pan out. We hoped, even at the beginning of the Putin presidency, when hope was maybe at its peak, we hoped that investment and engagement would lead to change, and that there was still some possibility, some potential for some sort of, the words that you want to say here are liberal democracy, but it just sounds so ridiculous to say it now. But there was a hope that some sort of, kind of elitist, clique-driven, sort of top-down democracy would be tolerable at the time, and that could work hand in hand with a market economy. And we just kept hoping. And even when we should have, that awful expression, should have, even when the signs were growing that wasn't happening, I think we all just recalibrated and carried on. Companies were nationalized. By the mid-2000s, more than 50% of Russian GDP was being put out by state-owned enterprises. The hand of the state was big and visible in the Russian economy. And I guess we just kept thinking that, next year's results are going to be fine. The year after that, we're going to increase our sales, and we're just going to keep going.
And do you think, to move beyond Russia, do you think companies should have this burden of sort of making social and moral judgments? Because obviously all of this is coinciding with a move against stakeholder capitalism, yeah, and the idea that we should pursue more than just profit.
Yeah, maybe this is the moment, and I think it's coming, that we adjust our expectations of companies. You choose your friends because you share the same values. And I think ideally, in a perfect world, maybe you want to buy things from a company on sort of the same grounds, that you share its values, or that it reflects something about you, just as your friends around you do. I think and you're hearing this in the sort of collapse of the ESG movement, that we shouldn't expect companies to hold the same values that we do, and that companies are kind of growing tired of pretending that they are our friends. You know, they're organizations that buy and make and sell things, and they try to make them well and sell them at an okay price and make sure that you come back as a customer. And if you're happy with that transaction, then that's maybe all that we reasonably can expect of a company. There'll be differences at the middle of this and also along the fringes about, you know, human rights and about child labor and about, you know, the use of resources but I think we've learned that the amount of times that you can count on a company to make you happy about its values is diminishing.
And of course, it's in America, you know, there's been a wave of lawsuits of sort of right-leaning activists and politicians suing companies for having goals that are anything but profit, so having climate goals, which is really our segue into Trump. How does the re-election of Donald Trump change things for companies, and what is the conversation, do you think, now in the boardroom of Pepsi and Mondelez?
Yeah, so I was so happy when I learned that the date for this event was after the US elections. And I thought, oh great, you know, it'll be so much easier to talk about all of this because the elections would be behind us, one way or the other. You know, no matter what happened, we would be able to make up our minds about where this is all going. And it's actually surprising, maybe not so surprising, to learn that actually, even though we have, you know, the elections have been resolved, and we have a candidate going forward, it hasn't necessarily becoming any easier to figure out how this is all going to end. A couple of things here. I mean, President-elect Trump is just putting together his, you know, economic and foreign policy team. On paper, sort of his top three officials with this portfolio are sort of Russia hawks, but they are Russia hawks second, and they're America first. And so that makes you a different kind of Russia hawk than a Russia hawk from, you know, the old school, from, you know, the Cold War Russia hawks. So there's a foreign policy team that, you know, probably will seek some sort of durable ceasefire that reflects the status quo as far as territory is concerned. There is no way that anybody in the Trump administration is going to discuss NATO membership for Ukraine. And there's, you know, a beginning of a conversation about sort of stuffing Ukraine with Western weapons as a security guarantee in place of NATO. And there's even been discussion of putting boots on the ground in a sort of peacekeeping capacity along the line of contact, or you know, where the current front is. But you know, I don't, you know, nobody knows right now how it's going to come out, because in spite of having appointed 3 relative Russia hawks to his foreign policy portfolio, then you have the president himself, who is mercurial, unpredictable, and who likes to boast about his relationship with Putin, on which, you know, he's kind of doing okay in Ukraine right now and doesn't have much incentive to come to the table in the first place. That will affect the outcome of those negotiations. And then what everybody's wondering about, and this was, you know, when during the campaign, when candidate Trump spoke at the New York Economic Forum, he was asked from the podium during the Q&A period, you know, when are you going to take sanctions? What are you going to do about sanctions? When are you going to relieve us of all of these Russia sanctions? And he says, you know, I will as soon as I can. We know that Trump doesn't like sanctions because he fears that it damages the dollar as an instrument in global trade. What I can't get my head around right now, though, is this sort of triple whammy or double whammy, I guess, of allowing territorial concessions and relieving sanctions. I don't quite know how you square that, to let Russia keep the territory that it has invaded and also administratively illegally annexed to let that stay the way it is, and then also to say, well, okay, then all's forgiven, and we're relieving all these sanctions. I don't know how that comes out.
And do you think even if sanctions don't get lifted in the next year or two, do you think that the companies that stayed are actually sort of on the superior wave, riding a superior wave right now, and they're feeling quite pleased with themselves?
Yeah. Will there come a time when we think about all the companies who stayed as being super smart? Yeah.
Yeah. And will they? I mean, yeah, essentially, or are they already possibly thinking of themselves as super smart when they're considering their options?
Yeah. I mean, I told you so is one of those great phrases that you wait a long time to use, and then you unfurl it when you can. Smart looks in a bunch of different ways. If you were a company in February of 2022 that said, 2 years from now, there are going to be elections in the United States, and Donald Trump is going to win them, and this is all going to get taken care of, so we're going to stay. If you were somebody who said that, then maybe that's what smart looks like. It's, I feel strongly that no one was really thinking that then. And the decision to stay or to go were made by all of these different things that we were talking about in the beginning of our conversation. And there was some companies did it very calmly, and others did it in a sort of terrified sweat. But those were the decisions made back then. There are a couple of companies. One of the really interesting things that came out of all of this is the notion of risk appetite. And there are some companies that, without the political calculating, there were companies that said, we're going to sit this out no matter what. We've got too much at stake. We're not going to go. This is going to be massively painful for us, but we're not going. And I don't know if those are the ones who are sort of riding this wave that you... I'm thinking more about, companies with just multi-billion dollars on the ground, or under the ground in Russia. Lots of companies, not exclusively energy companies, who are just sort of, we'll go, either we're going to sit this out or we're going to go back the minute we can.
Excellent. Well, I think we've got time now to ask for some questions from the audience, and I'm going to take 3 at a time if there are lots of questions, so that we save time. So Laurent, 2, and then 3.
I wasn't planning to ask 3 questions, but
No, 1 each, but 3 people. That's very good.
no. So, moving away from geopolitics to domestic politics and political risk for businesses in Russia. If in the business and human rights community, people say, a country that doesn't respect human rights, by definition, doesn't respect the rule of law and is a bad place to invest. Did, in your discussions with companies, going from, sort of the early part of the Putin period when human rights situation in Russia started to deteriorating, did anyone think about things in that way at all? Or is that just something that business and human rights people say and companies don't pay it any mind?
There were 2 over there, over here.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for the book, and thank you, Dasha, Charles, for this discussion. And I actually have 2 small questions, I promise. They're quite quick. I'm a writer myself, and I'm not a specialist in international business. What I liked about your book is the human touch. It reads like a novel at times, and I urge everybody who hasn't read this book, just read it, and it provokes very personal responses. So when you mentioned the arc, as in the way you tell the story, I could feel that you were thinking about these things. And when I started reading it, I felt very moved by stories of your characters. There is Grant, Mr. Grant, who is crying because he has to leave his well-furnished kitchen in Moscow, and I felt very I left Moscow 20 years ago, and I felt moved by that. I missed my kitchen in Moscow. So, and then the book opens with Melling, I think, Mr. Melling having to go back through the security because his plane was stopped. And so I felt like, as a writer, you made us feel sorry almost, like empathize with the characters. So my first question is, how do you justify this from the marketing point of view in this kind of, I imagine sharing this page or story with my friends on Facebook, and I imagine people would say, people are dying under the bombs, how, can we feel, should we feel sorry for these people? Can we, then my second question is, if you had to write a similar book about the arc of international business in Ukraine, since you've traveled around both countries, would it be similar, different, and in what way? Thank you.
So maybe that's enough. That's 3 questions. So if you're ready, or yeah.
Right. Thank you for those questions, and thank you very much for the kind words about the book. Human rights almost never came up. In the scope of things, I think that companies with international footprints were more concerned about human rights in other jurisdictions and in sectors where this is a more typical concern. I did a lot of the due diligence work in the 90s and the early 2000s, and it almost never came up. After that, I got a little bit detached from that process, but still don't think that it came up. And even with the advent of ESG pressure, I don't recall really whether it was directly or reading or hearing, the human rights conversation focusing on Russia, really. Rule of law was a massive topic of discussion, to the second point. Because in the early days, Russia was not a rule of law country. And then in its subsequent development, it became a rule of law country on paper, but it didn't become a rule of law country in its execution of what was on that paper. And I talked to a lot of lawyers, and almost down to the very last one, they all said, Russian law was good. It was written to international standards. I see some heads nodding in the audience, and so thank you for that. That Russian law was written to a perfectly strong international standard, and that Russian commercial courts, by and large, were predictable, and if we had a certain kind of complaint, we could, by and large, count on a certain kind of outcome. Beyond that, though, the notion that maybe everybody in this room is familiar with of sort of telephone justice, of getting your verdicts phoned down to you from on high, remained, and that it was not so much the writing of the law, it was the application of the law that was hugely problematic from a sort of domestic political risk perspective. Does that touch it? Great. Okay. So on the second question about how do we justify this, there is no justification for what's happening in Ukraine right now. It is a unprovoked war of aggression with a phenomenal human cost, and there is no justification for it, full stop. How do you justify a business presence in Russia under these circumstances? I think one of it is from the questions that Dasha raised, and that is, what do we expect from companies now? Do we want companies to act like people and have a conscience? Do we want them to just make a good product that we can get at a decent price and move on? What do we want from them? And what do we expect from them? And does, and this is a question, does selling biscuits in Russia require justification? If you're paying taxes to a government that's waging war, then you have some fairly serious questions to ask yourself. But, aside from the guy quoted in the FT who said, our shareholders don't care, we're not going to hear much more in terms of justification from companies, other than, we make loo roll, so leave us alone. As to Ukraine, the arc of international business in Ukraine, I think in responding to that, because I'm not a Ukraine expert, I think that the area of focus and what we should be thinking about, particularly as was Dasha suggesting in her last question about Trump, is what does rebuilding look like? And there have already been 2 annual international conferences, the sort of headline-grabbing conferences on rebuilding Ukraine. And for the very first one, which was a year or so ago, the queue was out the door to get in. I mean, the number of people who signed up and the number of sponsors and the number of companies was enormous. There was one that was much more recent, and the numbers were significantly lower than the year before. And so maybe something that I neglected to answer, Dasha, in responding to your last question, is that the way that Trump conducts his policy, and he just today appointed Keith Kellogg as his special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, the way he conducts that policy is going to severely impact Ukraine's ability to establish a new arc of business in its efforts to rebuild.
Thank you. So we've got 2 here and 1 at the back.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting and brings back a lot of memories. But on the question of the rule of law, I'd just like to remind people that the Stalin Constitution was pretty good too. But that's just a remark. We've been here before, Chuck. If you see beautiful things in Russia, Belaruski Vokzal is something that I give as the example of this. It was all financed by foreign money. And there was a huge amount of foreign investment in Russia before the revolution. Indeed, the rate of economic growth and economic development in Russia before the First World War was twice as fast, growth was twice as fast as the United States. One of the reasons why we went to war in 1914 was the Germans were afraid that if they left it for 10 years, the Russian economy and the Russian army would be more powerful than the German one, in the same way the Brits feared that the German navy would be greater than theirs in 10 years too. So it's against this background. And then what happened to all these industries? Well, we had the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Revolution destroyed whatever a capitalism, foreign or domestic, was there. So, as always, Russia kills the brightest and the best and the most entrepreneurial. It either kills them or exiles them. And this process has continued. So this is a country which actually has not come has never actually come to terms with its past. Now, this has effect on foreigners coming to such a country, because all the plants that were being put up with foreign investment and so on and so forth, all on alien territory, essentially, on shaky foundations. Well, this is the second time round. Will there be a third time? Who exactly is going to invest in Russia once the war in Ukraine is over, and at some point, presumably, there'll be a change of regime? Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Could you tell us anything about how the distribution of seized and deeply discounted assets is being organized amongst the Russian elite?
So, first of all, thanks for the very interesting session. So, my understanding of sanctions is that international sanctions should hurt the sanctioned country more than the countries imposing sanctions. I've heard several commentators say that many of the sanctions are hurting us more than Russia, and its economy seems to be doing better. I just wonder, when you were writing your book, if you explored this, and if you have any view on it.
Okay, on the subject of we've been here before, absolutely right. And what I should have also pointed out when Dasha asked about Siemens is that Siemens had a massive presence on the eve of World War I, on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, and everything was nationalized. I mean, just the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel. 4 different Siemens international companies were seized by the Bolsheviks. So, you know, yeah, we have been here before. The other thing that's really interesting is that the world was at its most globalized, in spite of everything that we've been talking about for the past 20 or 30 years, the world was at its most globalized on the eve of World War I. And it was only really just a few years ago that the amount of kind of international commerce, sort of like for like, you know, dollar for dollar, now and then, was only a couple of years ago that the world became more globalized than it had been on the eve of World War I. So you're absolutely right in all of those assertions. Will there be a third time? And who? So, you know, there's a part of me that wants to be dramatic and say that this is going to take a generation to fix, and that it'll be a really long time before we see anybody going back there. I think that's probably being optimistic. The cynic in me will probably be surprised at how quickly people go back. The real question is, under what terms? And, you know, what will the T's and C's be of going back to Russia? And for all of the companies that exited with a buyback clause in their contract, in their sales contract, you know, how durable will that all be? And if the terms and conditions are monstrous, then it'll be super interesting to see who goes, what kind of, you know, armor they put on to do it, and how it works out. So, you know, it could be anything between, you know, there are companies who, before I, you know, left to write the book, and this is, you know, in the very early stages of the conflict, there were companies saying, when can we go back? Now, again, this is in the early stages before things, you know, got as bad as they are now. But there were already companies saying, when can we go back? So, you know, part of me thinks it's going to take a generation to sort this out. Part of me says, yeah, right, you'll be surprised. Don't know. The organization of the redistribution of property in Russia, how is that being organized? Badly, very badly. From the inside, people are saying that this is the mosh pit. And that, you know, and this is sort of borrowing from somebody who's sitting in this room this evening, you know, if you look at the sort of top, you know, there's the Forbes billionaires and millionaires list in Russia. If you look at the very top of that list, those people are all sanctioned. And so you can't redistribute property to them unless it's through a loophole that I think exists. You know, if the property was nationalized, then you can sort of give it to whoever you want. But once you work your way down the billionaires list, there's still a bunch of people who can take a lot of property. And they are all, it's sort of, you know, cats under a rug sort of thing. There's vested interest, the seeking of political favoritism, you know, top-down decision-making with bottom-up influence. It's a melee for these assets. And so I think the redistribution and the sort of deprivatization that we see happening in Russia is a mess. It's not orderly at all. Sanctions. Thank you for your question. You're absolutely right. Sanctions are supposed to hurt the sanctioned entity more than the sanctioning entity, although every state and its sort of constituents, you know, its companies, know the likelihood of blowback. And I think the European community, business community, feels that much more acutely when it comes to Russia than the American community. And, you know, America's sort of the leading sanctioning entity here, and has less to lose from all of this than the Europeans, who have multiples more business with Russia and are suffering much more as a result of these sanctions. That leads in part to the rather elaborate and sort of shocking sanctions workarounds that you see. So that's kind of a mitigating force or a mitigating factor. But, you know, I think there was a misapprehension at the beginning of the institution of the sanctions regimes, and that is that everyone thought, oh, we're going to put lots of sanctions on Russia, and the economy is going to collapse, and they'll be waving the white flag, you know, weeks later. That was a bad misunderstanding, and either I'm not being forgiving enough, or there weren't enough people in the government thinking, well, what's happened with other countries when we've sanctioned them as well? So, you know, there's a whole cottage industry in predicting the collapse of the Russian economy. It's getting bad, and it's getting worse, and there is a cost. There's no question that there's a cost to the Russian economy as a result of these sanctions regimes. And I think that even today, the greatest deciding factor, perhaps, in Russia is not the loss of life in the Russian army or the hardship of Russian consumers, but it's the sort of the macroeconomic picture. And so there is pain. It's coming. You know, there's only so long that this can last, perhaps, but it's lasted a lot longer than any of us thought it would.
So we've got one question at the back. That was the first one, and then we can maybe you could go to this.
I'm going to stand up because I can't see you back all the way back here, Chuck. Can you hear me?
Hi, Toby.
You at the beginning said that's it. I like your good story. It's got a beginning, middle, and end. And great thing about this book, by the way, it's a great story. It's a really interesting story. And it is packed with lots of analysis, but you're a great storyteller, and it's a fantastic read, so I'll do my plug. But have a question as well. In writing the book, researching and writing the book, what was the bit that you were most surprised about? I mean, you've been living this story during the whole arc, but when you research something and you start thinking about it, sometimes you get struck by something that is really surprising. So what was the thing that you find most surprising? And what was the bit which you found most fun in researching and then writing the book about things that you looked at while you were preparing the book?
We've got one more here, and then we move to the front.
On learning lessons, and I know you mentioned that you can't draw parallels between any two situations, but thinking about China, because many people are saying that the possible invasion of Taiwan is a very real likelihood, and there's a sense of an inevitability from the Chinese perspective that eventually this will happen. We've also seen warning signs that you could think of as 2014 situations like in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. So you called it apples and oranges, China and Russia, but what are the meaningful differences between those two situations and the possible business reaction there could be to a hypothetical invasion, let's say, of Taiwan?
Hi, I just wondered how your personal emotional relationship with Russia has changed with the writing of the book and also with what's happening in the region.
Thank you for the question about what I found most surprising and what I found most interesting. So there was a phrase that came up over and over again in so many of the interviews that I did for the book. And that phrase was cognitive dissonance. And I was surprised at how often people use that expression, sometimes to kind of excuse their behavior in Russia, sometimes to explain logically their behavior in the market. But they kept on saying, you know, we were seeing one thing in front of us, but we were doing something as if that wasn't happening. And one of the anecdotes was that after the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea, there was a business dinner at the residence of the British ambassador in Moscow, who was saying, oh, and by the way, you know, with Western, you know, British and international business people, and was saying, by the way, don't forget to do your IPOs on the London Stock Exchange. So, you know, you've got one thing going here and then another thing going on here, and I was a little bit surprised at how often that came up and how many times people said, you know, this involved breathtaking levels of cognitive dissonance to sort of maintain our presence there. And maybe, again, Dasha, that goes back to your question about sort of the violins or who was smart or what were we thinking. And that is that we were thinking two things at the same time, maybe. And I guess what's surprising is that how widespread that was. As to what I had the most fun researching and writing about, a couple of things. I had the most fun writing things that I didn't have to research. You know, things that I either did or saw myself. And this book, by the way, for the sake of clarity, this book is not a memoir and I'm not in the book. But there were parts that I knew pretty well and could sort of write off the top of my head, and that was fun because it was easier. The other thing is just that the sheer excitement of immersing yourself in a topic, whether it was in person with individuals or in the British Library, or you know, just in sort of returning to a place that you lived in, that you thought you knew pretty well, and that was important, an important part of your professional life and career. Going back to that was gratifying. The circumstances were dreadful, but you know, and maybe that goes to your question about sort of my personal feelings about the place. And you know, my personal feelings really shouldn't matter to any of you, but I will say a couple of things. If there is any silver lining to what's happening now, it's that, with very few exceptions, all of my friends live here now. And I can visit all of my Russian friends by getting on the tube instead of by getting on an airplane. And that's been personally helpful, I guess is the word you could use. I'm glad that they're safe. I'm glad that they're out. And I'm glad that I can see them for dinner on a Friday night. For the friends who stayed, I offer no judgment. They all have different reasons, and they're valid, and they're personal, and I respect them. There are people who couldn't leave, just couldn't. Very few people who didn't want to. Most were in the couldn't leave. Do I wish I could go there now? Yes. Do I miss it? Yes. But you know, what Russia do I miss? Is it the Russia that's there now, and the one that I would find if I got off the plane at Domodedovo now? You know, would it be the same? I don't know. Could you make it into that place that you once lived in and once liked? I don't know. Probably not, on balance. Do all of us who are Russophiles without being Kremlinophiles, can we reconcile that? I do. I do that in my head every day. And you know, I hope one day that it becomes a lot easier to reconcile that equation. And until then, you know, it's personal. But thank you for the question. Was there another question? Oh, God, yeah, sorry. I'm not avoiding your China question. It was a really, really good question. Yeah, so it's sort of apples and oranges, and there are meaningful differences. And now I'm going to say something that's going to get me in a ton of trouble, because what we were saying in the geopolitical risk business was that the likelihood of China invading Taiwan is low. And the problem with that is that every low likelihood forecast that we've ever made has sooner or later materialized. You know, invading Russia was low likelihood, and the global pandemic was low likelihood, and Trump 1.0 was low likelihood. And lo and behold, all of this stuff comes true, and you find yourself eating a lot of your words. And the day may come when we eat our words on China and Taiwan. People who follow that think that that day, if it happens, is in the pretty distant future. We'll see. Everything's up for grabs starting in January of next year. But this is still a distant likelihood. I think, and you're right to point out that there are companies leaving China now, and there are companies managing geopolitical and political risk in China now. I think the drivers for that risk management are different from the ones in Russia. And I think that the primary driver, the thing that got everybody out, and this is, again, in chapter 1, at the first sort of epigraph at the top of chapter 1 is, look what it took to get companies out of Russia. It took a war. Up until that, everything was fine. The drivers for getting out of China, I think, are completely different. And that is really the reorientation of Chinese industrial policy away from being the world's factory to sort of saying, hey, look, we're a market. We have our own industrial capacity. We don't need you to come here and make things that you're now going to ship out of China. We have national champions. And that the drivers there are, maybe there's a bit of, in case of an invasion, we better get out now. But I think that the drivers are domestic politics there, industrial policy, and even the companies that are sort of, quote unquote, leaving China, they're not entirely leaving. They're doing, a lot of them, what's called a China plus one strategy, which means that you de-emphasize your presence in China, and then you build something in Vietnam, or you build something in Thailand, or you build something in India that supplements or adds capacity to what you're doing in China, just in case. So it's different.
Apologies to, I think we have to wrap up now, don't we? That was going to be my suggestion. So,
At the bar?
We can take a round of 3, and then that's it. Yeah.
One more round of 3, and then please come to the bar. Questions are a lot easier at bars.
Got one here, one over there, and that's perfect. That's 3. No one's put me in a tough spot there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. From what you said, and from what we heard here, it leaves an impression that this arc was kind of predestined. That the destiny of this arc was to fall because it was in Russia. And from your understanding, is it the role of Russia and Russians, or can be the role of Putin discerned from it? Is it Putin what led to the demise of this arc? So do you separate Russia and Russians and Putin when you describe this arc and the reasons why it went that way? Thank you.
Charles.
Oh, hi.
Hi there.
Yes.
You've already answered the question that you knew I would probably ask, which was, we all sat in a room in 2014 and said, was what's happening now on anybody's piece of paper as a scenario? And you've already indicated the answer was no. So I'd like to, we've already talked about Trump, so I might as well throw in another silly name, Mr. Rumsfeld. He never wrote about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns and all the rest of it. But we spend a lot of time, and I'm now retired, so I've actually changed my philosophy. And my philosophy is I don't give a damn about the known unknowns anymore because I can't measure them. And let me loop round with the congratulations, because I think the book, and I'm halfway through it, has got some really great quotes in that do make you stop and think and associate with them and have the experience. But I'll leave with one, which was Mr. Gudsnitsky, I believe, who was talking about, in your book, about never let a president of a major company, of a major country, be isolated during a period of a global pandemic and allow him to read some history. And to quote somebody who you know and I know as well, Jade McGlynn, especially when that history is illiberal. So my question is, should we just forget about all of the, if that's the sort of thing that can happen, and it goes back to this gentleman's question about, do we judge Putin or do we judge Russia? In the end, there are just risks that you cannot assess, and therefore you just go to Las Vegas and put your money on the table.
Go ahead. There's a mic.
Hi, Chuck. Also a bit of a China-related question, but a different angle. You talk about Western companies feeding the Russian monster, about how all this misplaced pipe dream about political and business engagement, hoping to engender some sort of liberal democracy, but didn't happen. The question is there some sort of common playbook that Russia and China are using to game the US-led system since 1991? Or is there some sort of mutual learning going on there that you may have detected? Thank you.
So I'm going to need a trip to the bar after all of these questions. Seriously, please do join me. There's a super cozy bar upstairs at Pushkin House, and it's a minute over the road. Was this predestined? And is it Putin who was responsible solely for the bend in this arc? I feel a question that is leaning towards the concept of collective guilt, and you're shaking your head, which is good, because I kind of don't want to go there. But I think I can answer your question by saying there is never a single factor that is responsible for any sort of geopolitical or political trend that we see, including the bending of this arc in Russia. And I guess back to Toby's question about, what surprised me. Companies are forever looking for one answer to their questions. They're looking for one factor. They're looking for a magic bullet. They're looking for the key to all of their problems, and it seems to always be one thing that they want to explain something. And it's fruitless to do that. Because, yes, of course, Putin is a serious driver of Russian politics. He's this, one of the sole drivers of Russian politics, but not the sole driver. And so if we were looking for, the other thing is I don't believe in predestination. I don't believe in that kind of stuff. Things do seem, there are views that history is linear and you never look back. There are views that history is cyclical and, everything old is new again, and you just have to live long enough to see it all happen. I'm in the cyclical camp, but I don't think any one individual ever lives long enough to see a full cycle turn. And if you do, watch out, because that means things are pretty rotten. But I don't think that there was any sole driver. I don't think it was predestined. I don't think there's a sole driver. And it certainly wasn't solely Putin, though, to Howard's point about, this is a quote from an interview I did with Sevagunitsky, who's a professor of Russian politics at the University of Toronto, super guy. And he said, Putin was holed up during the pandemic in isolation, reading a lot of Russian history, and that's a really, really bad idea. And so this, and I agree with that. But to your question about, are there any risks that we just can't assess? And should we just sort of, give up because at the end of the day we'll never cover everything, or something will always turn around and bite us in the hindquarters? I think, yeah, of course, in a practical level, you can never cover all the bases. On a more philosophical level, something will always come up. The real answer to your question, though, is that there will always be, no matter how many risks you can itemize and identify, there will always be organizations that will have an absolutely voracious appetite for risk. And whether you've quantified them all, or whether you've missed a few, or whether they're going to come at you later, there will always be at least one company, I promise you, that will say, we got this. So people will keep going back. Right, the US-led system, thank you for that. It's clear, and it's been clear since 2007, if not before, but concrete since 2007, that Putin is hostile to the Western-led system. And this is what he's trying to do with the BRICS organization, is to try to sort of to feed and fertilize this sort of growth of some sort of challenge to the Western system. And China clearly feels that a geopolitical construct that is dominated by a unipolar power is unfavorable to them. Does China want to become instead that unipolar power? I don't think so. Would it like to see greater, is balance the word? I don't know. Would it like to see a sort of more multipolar system where it exercises its share of weight, absolutely. That's a system that's going to harbor a lot of surprises for all of us, I think. But is that a driver of what's happening now? Absolutely.
Thank you so much for these excellent questions. That was really fascinating. And as Charles said, please join us over at the bar, especially if you've got more. I think he's still going. He's still up for it.
Happy to answer questions over a drink, please.
Please. Buy the man a drink.
Dasha, thank you.
Thank you.